My name is Catherine Wellet, and at 63 years old, I believed I had already made peace with the ways life could quietly break a person. Raised in a small town outside Moncton, I had learned early that dignity was not something handed to you at birth. It was something you carried yourself through every difficult season, through every room that made you feel like a stranger. I thought I understood that lesson well. I thought I had lived it completely. But nothing in 63 years of living prepared me for the moment my son's new mother-in-law pointed toward the far end of the reception hall and said, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, "We saved you a lovely spot near the windows, missus." Oh well, lovely spot. That was what she called it, a round table for 8, tucked behind the catering station, half hidden by a partition screen, printed with climbing ivy. From where I sat, I could see the kitchen doors swinging open and shut. I could hear the clatter of plates being stacked and the muffled instructions of the catering supervisor. I could smell the industrial cleaner they had used on the floor that morning. Across the room, past the centerpieces and the chandeliers and the tables draped in ivory linen, my son Thomas sat beside his bride, laughing at something one of her cousins had said. He did not look toward my corner once. I had driven 4 hours from Fredericton to be there. I had saved for 3 months to buy the dusty rose dress hanging in my closet, the one I had pressed twice the morning of the wedding, because I wanted everything to be right. I had written a card by hand, 3 drafts, because I wanted the words to reflect something true about who Thomas was and how proud I had always been. I had done all of that, and still I was seated near the catering station at my only son's wedding, while his wife's family occupied the front tables with their tailored jackets and their easy laughter and their way of looking through people like me as if we were part of the decor. The woman at the table beside mine leaned over and asked if I was with the catering staff. I told her I was the mother of the groom. She looked at me with an expression I recognized, the kind that forms when a person does not know what to say because they are embarrassed on your behalf. She patted my hand and turned back to her plate. I kept my posture straight. I reminded myself that I had raised Thomas alone after his father, Robert, passed away from a heart attack when Thomas was only 11 years old. I had worked 2 jobs for 4 years so that Thomas could stay in hockey, because hockey was the one thing that made him feel close to his father's memory. I had eaten soup from a can so many times that winter that I still cannot smell chicken broth without feeling the particular exhaustion of those years. None of that was something I regretted, not one day of it. But sitting in that corner, wearing my carefully pressed dusty rose dress, listening to the kitchen doors bang and swing behind me, I felt the weight of all of it in a way I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time. That was when the chair beside me moved. A man sat down, not fumbling, not apologetic, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided exactly where he intended to be. He was perhaps 68 or 69, with close-cut silver hair and the kind of calm in his eyes that only comes from having survived something significant. He wore a dark navy suit, no tie, and when he turned to look at me, there was nothing performative about his attention. He was simply looking at me the way a person looks when they actually see you. "They put you here on purpose," he said, "not a question." I blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I watched them redirect you when you came in." He glanced toward the front of the room, then back at me. That takes a particular kind of nerve. I did not know what to say. He extended his hand. "Gordon Beauchamp. I was invited by the groom's firm. I'm here representing a development project." He paused. "And you?" "Catherine Wellet," I said. "I'm Thomas's mother." Something shifted in his expression, not pity, nothing so uncomfortable as that. It was more like recognition, the way a person's face changes when a picture becomes clear. He settled back in his chair and said simply, "Then I'm glad I chose this table." I had met Gordon Beauchamp exactly once before, 27 years ago, at a municipal planning conference in Halifax. I had been there with the community housing association I worked for at the time. He had been a junior developer presenting a proposal for affordable housing units in Cape Breton. We had spoken for perhaps 40 minutes over stale coffee and a plate of cheese and crackers, and then life had redirected us both in the way it so often does. I had thought about that conversation more than once over the years. Not because of any romance, nothing like that, but because it was one of those rare conversations where a person says something that settles into you and stays. He had said, "The people who get moved to the edges of the room are usually the ones everyone else is afraid of." I had never forgotten that. He remembered the conference, too. He remembered the cheese and crackers. He laughed when I brought it up, a genuine laugh, the kind that belongs to people who are not performing for anyone. We were still talking when the speeches began. I watched Thomas stand and raise his glass and speak beautifully about his wife Melissa, about her grace and her intelligence and her family's generosity. He spoke for 6 minutes. He did not mention me once. I watched Gordon notice this. He did not say anything. He simply poured a small amount of water into my glass without being asked, and the gesture was so quiet and so decent that I had to look away for a moment. After the speeches, Melissa's mother, Patricia Caldwell, materialized at our table. Patricia was the kind of woman who wore her confidence like a garment perfectly fitted, never wrinkled, always appropriate for the occasion. She had the look of someone who had spent decades managing situations from a distance, and she wore it well. Her eyes moved from me to Gordon with a calculation she did not quite manage to conceal. "Gordon," she said warmly, "I didn't realize you'd been seated over here. There must have been a mix-up with the chart." "No mix-up," Gordon said pleasantly. "I moved myself." Patricia laughed, a small, contained laugh. "Well, I hope you're both comfortable. Catherine, isn't it? Thomas has mentioned you." She said it in the way people sometimes say things that are technically true but designed to communicate something else entirely. "He has a great deal to mention," I said. She smiled the tight smile. "Of course." Then, to Gordon, "I was hoping we might have a chance to speak later about the Harborview project. My husband has been very eager." "I'm sure he has," Gordon said. "We'll find a moment." Patricia drifted back toward the head tables, and Gordon watched her go with an expression that was not unkind but was very clear. "Harborview," he said quietly. "That's the waterfront development they've been trying to partner with us on for 8 months. He looked at me. "Their firm needs our environmental clearances to proceed. Without them, they can't break ground." I processed that slowly. "And you're the one who holds the clearances?" "Beauchamp Environmental Consulting," he said. "Has been for 30 years. I sat with that information for a moment, watching Patricia Caldwell across the room, watching her bend toward her husband and whisper something in his ear, watching him glance toward our corner table with an expression that was trying very hard to look casual. "She knew who you were when she came over," I said. Gordon picked up his water glass. "She's known since the seating chart was made. Someone decided to put us both over here, thinking distance was the same thing as invisibility." He looked at me directly. "It usually isn't." The evening moved on. Thomas came to my table once, briefly, to squeeze my shoulder and say, "You look great, Mom," in the voice of a man who is fulfilling an obligation he has scheduled between 2 other obligations. I held his hand for a moment and told him I was happy for him. I meant it, even though it lived alongside something else, something quieter and considerably more painful. He moved back toward the front of the room, and I watched him go. And I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep with his hockey jersey still on because he was too tired after practice to change. And I thought about how much I had loved that boy, and how I was still loving him even now, even here, even from this corner near the kitchen doors. Gordon stayed beside me for the rest of the evening. We talked about Fredericton, about the changes along the St. John River corridor, about a particular bookshop on King Street that we had both visited independently and both loved. We talked about his work in environmental assessment, about the years I had spent in community housing advocacy before I retired. There was an ease to it that surprised me. Not the ease of old friendship, but the ease of 2 people who have long since stopped pretending to be anything other than what they are. When the night ended, Gordon walked me to the parking area. Before we separated, he said, "Catherine, I'd like to call you this week, if you're willing. There's something I'd like you to be part of." I told him I was willing, and I drove the 4 hours back to Fredericton with something I could not quite name sitting quietly in my chest. 3 days passed before Thomas called. When he did, his voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed. "Mom, Melissa and I would like to take you to dinner." Saturday, the Seasons restaurant downtown. The Seasons was not a casual choice. It was where Thomas took clients when something significant needed to be discussed across a white tablecloth. I understood the invitation for what it was, and I went anyway, because some conversations need to be walked into rather than avoided. The restaurant was quiet and candlelit, the kind of place where everyone speaks just slightly below their natural volume. Melissa stood when I arrived, smiling the careful smile she reserved for situations that required management. Thomas pulled out my chair with exaggerated courtesy. We ordered. There was small talk about the wedding photos, about the hotel in Charlottetown where they were honeymooning. And then Melissa set down her fork and folded her hands. "We've been hearing some things," she said, "about Gordon Beauchamp and his firm's decision on the Harborview clearances." There it was. "His company is apparently reconsidering the partnership," she continued, keeping her voice even. "My parents have invested a great deal into that project. A delay would be very difficult for everyone." She paused. "We were hoping you might be willing to speak with him, put in a good word for the family, since you seem to have developed a rapport." I looked at my son. He was looking at the candle. "Thomas," I said. He looked up. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." I kept my voice gentle. "When you planned the seating at your wedding, did you know where I had been placed?" The silence lasted long enough to answer the question before he did. "It was complicated," he said. "Patricia had strong opinions about the layout, and I thought it was just for one evening." "It was," I said. "It was one evening, but the message it sent was not a small one." I looked at Melissa. "You seated me behind the catering partition at my son's wedding and told me it was a lovely spot near the windows. And now, 3 days later, you are asking me to use a connection I made at that table, a connection I made because I was sitting alone and someone decent chose to sit beside me to help your family's business interests." I paused. "I want you to hear how that sounds." Melissa's composure held, but something behind her eyes shifted. "I have spent 30 years asking nothing from either of you," I said. "I did not ask Thomas for help when the furnace broke 2 winters ago. I did not ask for anything when I had my knee surgery and managed 3 weeks of recovery by myself. I asked only to be treated as someone whose presence in your lives holds some value." I put my napkin on the table. "That is still all I am asking." Thomas's jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he was going to retreat into the careful neutrality again. Instead, something behind his eyes gave way, and he put his face in his hands. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. The words were rough, unpolished, nothing like the speech at the wedding. "I'm sorry. I knew it wasn't right, and I let it happen, and I'm sorry." Melissa was very still. I reached across and put my hand briefly on Thomas's arm. "I know," I said, "and that is a beginning. But a beginning is not the same as the whole work." I did not call Gordon on Melissa's behalf. He called me, as he had said he would, and we spoke for a long time about the Daniel Wellett Community Development Fund, a small housing advocacy fund I had set up years earlier in Robert's memory to assist first-time homebuyers in under-resourced communities. Gordon had found a reference to it in some old municipal records during a project review, and he had an idea. He wanted Beauchamp Environmental Consulting to make a significant contribution to the fund, not as a favor, not as a business arrangement, because, he said, it aligned with the work his firm had always tried to do, and because some things deserved more support than they received. We met the following week at his office on the 15th floor of a glass building overlooking the harbor. His assistant brought us tea, and we sat across a wide desk covered in topographical maps and assessment reports, and he walked me through the proposal with the same directness he had used at that table near the kitchen doors. The fund would receive a 5-year commitment. There would be a named scholarship for first-generation homebuyers under 40. The announcement would be made at the New Brunswick Community Housing Conference in the spring. "You don't have to do this," I said. "I know," he said. "That's rather the point." There was a pause, and then he said something quieter. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, Catherine, and I have sat across from a great many people in rooms like this one. Very few of them have made me think about a 40-minute conversation for 2.5 decades. He looked at me steadily. "I thought you should know that. I looked out at the harbor, at the cold, gray water moving steadily under the October sky. I thought about it too, I said. Not often, but sometimes. We did not make anything of it that afternoon. Some things unfold at their own pace, and I had learned, at 63, that rushing the unfolding rarely improved it. What happened with Harborview was not something I engineered, and I want to be clear about that. Gordon's firm made its decision on the environmental clearances based entirely on the assessment his team conducted. The Caldwell's project had 3 significant issues in the shoreline impact evaluation that needed to be addressed before any clearances could be granted. This was not revenge. This was a consulting firm doing its job without being influenced by a dinner conversation or a check or a quiet request from a woman at a corner table. But the Caldwells did not see it that way at first. Patricia Caldwell called me on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice was as controlled as ever, but there was a frequency beneath the control that I recognized the particular pitch of a person who has realized that their usual methods are not going to work this time. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," she said. "Patricia," I said, "I think we understand each other very well." A pause. "Catherine, the Harborview project represents a great deal of investment, a great deal of jobs for this community. I hope you understand what's at stake. I understand that Gordon's team found 3 separate issues with the shoreline assessment," I said. "I understand that those issues existed before I ever sat down at that table near your catering station. And I understand that if they are resolved properly, the project can move forward." I paused. "The process is the process, Patricia. It exists for everyone." Another silence. Then, more quietly, "What is it that you want?" "I want you to answer that question for yourself," I said, "because I think you already know." I ended the call and stood for a long time at my kitchen window, watching the late afternoon light move across the backyard, watching the maple tree my late husband Robert had planted the year Thomas was born, its leaves nearly gone now, its branches bare and uncomplicated against the pale sky. The apology, when it came, was not public the way Lydia's had been in the story that is not mine. It came at a Sunday dinner 6 weeks later, the first Sunday dinner Patricia Caldwell had ever attended at Thomas and Melissa's house in Quispamsis. I arrived to find the table set for 5, Thomas, Melissa, Patricia, her husband Gerald, and me. Melissa had cooked. Patricia had brought wine and a small envelope, which she handed me when I arrived, and which I did not open until I was sitting down. Inside was a handwritten note, 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged what had happened at the wedding. The second said that she had spent 40 years measuring people by the wrong standard, and that she was aware this did not excuse anything. The third said that she had made a donation, in my name and in Robert's memory, to a family housing charity in Fredericton. It was not a grand gesture, it was a sincere one. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. "Thank you," I said. "This is a beginning." Gerald Caldwell cleared his throat and said something about the wine he had brought being from a vineyard in the Okanagan, and we all turned our attention to the bottle, and dinner proceeded with the careful but genuine effort of people trying to build something new from awkward materials. These things take time. They take more than one dinner, but they have to start somewhere, and they started there. Thomas called me the following Tuesday, not about anything in particular, just a call. He asked how my knee was holding up, and whether I had been to the bookshop on King Street recently, and whether I had seen the first snow. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential and everything important, and when we said goodbye, his voice was the voice of the boy who used to fall asleep in his hockey jersey, and I held the phone for a moment after the call ended and felt something ease in my chest that had been held tight for longer than I wanted to admit. Gordon and I began meeting for coffee on Wednesday mornings at a cafe near the waterfront. We did not call it anything. We simply met and talked and occasionally disagreed about municipal planning decisions with a degree of enthusiasm that made the staff smile. In March, he asked if I would be willing to sit on the advisory committee for a new affordable housing initiative he was co-chairing with the province. I said yes. In April, we drove out to the Tantramar marshes on a Saturday because he had never been and I had always wanted to go back. We stood at the edge of the boardwalk in the early spring wind, watching the marsh birds move across the water, and he said that he had not stood somewhere this quiet in years. "Me neither," I said. He did not ask me anything more than that, and I did not offer more. But as we drove back toward the city, the radio playing something low and indistinct, the flat landscape opening on either side of the highway under a wide, pale sky, I thought about what it means to choose a future without preemptively apologizing for wanting one. I thought about the corner table and the kitchen doors and the folded program I had held in my lap during the ceremony. I thought about the woman I had been at that table, chin up, hands folded, heart quietly breaking, and I thought about the woman I was now, sitting in the passenger seat of a good man's car on an ordinary Saturday in April, heading back toward a city that held more possibility than it had 7 months ago. The Daniel Wellett Community Development Fund held its first scholarship presentation at the Spring Housing Conference in Moncton. 16 applicants, 4 recipients. The youngest was 24, a Métis woman from Bathurst who wanted to buy a home near her mother. The oldest was 38, a single father from Edmundston who had been saving for 6 years. When the recipients were announced, the room filled with the particular kind of applause that belongs to moments when something real has happened. I stood at the back of the room and watched, and thought about Robert, about his hands, about the maple tree, about the way he used to say that a life built with intention is its own kind of architecture. He would have been very pleased. Afterward, Gordon found me by the coffee station and stood beside me, and we watched the scholarship recipients speaking with their families, and he said, he would have been proud of this. He would have argued with you about the structural design of the award criteria, I said. Gordon laughed. Then I'm sorry I didn't get to meet him. He would have liked you, I said. He was suspicious of people who were too smooth. You're not smooth. That's the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years. We drove back to Fredericton together that evening, talking and quiet in equal measure, the highway stretching out under the early spring darkness, the radio on low. I watched the familiar landscape unfold outside the window, the rivers, the tree lines, the small lit houses set back from the road, and I felt a satisfaction that was not triumph and not resolution, but something more durable than either. It was the quiet, particular satisfaction of a life that had not been diminished by the people who tried to diminish it. There is something I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in any part of this story. You will encounter people in your life who measure your worth by your postal code, by your bank account, by the table they have decided to seat you at. They will do this with great efficiency and very little guilt, because they have been doing it so long it no longer registers as a choice. It has simply become the way things are. And if you are not careful, you will begin to believe that the table they have chosen for you is the table you deserve. It is not. Your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Your dignity does not depend on their recognition. And the connections you form in the corners of rooms, the unexpected kindnesses, the quiet conversations, the people who choose to sit beside you not because it benefits them, but because it is the right thing to do, those connections are often the most significant ones of your life. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to insist on being treated with basic human decency, not as a favor, not as a concession, but as a baseline. You are allowed to rebuild, at 63 or 73 or 83, something new and honest and genuinely yours. And when someone hands you a check and asks you to fold yourself back into smallness, you are allowed to tear it up. If any part of Catherine's story stayed with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Leave a comment below whether it's a city, a province, or just a word that describes where you are today. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're looking for more stories about quiet strength, dignity, and the courage it takes to choose yourself, please subscribe to Revenge Unseen. Your seat is not at the back of the room. It never was.